Sunday at Polaris Fashion Place. I am watching Abby twirl in her newly bought blue dress. The scent of butter cookies and the sound of jazz music are rare luxuries for a staff sergeant on leave like me. The world is perfect. The restroom door just closed when Abby suddenly squeezed my hand, her fingernails digging deep into my skin. "Mom, shh," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Through the gap under the door, a pair of oversized polished leather shoes moved slowly and stopped right in front of us. The space froze. My motherly instinct vanished, replaced by a trained, killer instinct. My heart rate did not increase. It slowed down, ice cold. I pushed Abby back, my right hand instinctively searching for the gun at my hip, even though it only touched thin air. The smell of danger was thicker than the scent of disinfectant. A low male voice spoke, coldly reporting over the phone. "Target acquired. Maisie Barnes's daughter. She is wearing a blue dress. He is hunting us. Who sold out my secret schedule? And why does that person want to steal the only thing that keeps me human?" I felt the oxygen vanish from the small tiled stall, leaving only the metallic taste of adrenaline and the sharp chemical sting of bleach. This wasn't a random mall creep or a lost soul. This was a professional hit on my reality. I felt my jaw lock, my facial muscles setting into the mask I wore during 3 tours in Iraq. The face of a woman who had seen the abyss and survived it. My fingers, calloused from years of handling heavy equipment and cleaning carbon off M4 bolts, gripped my smartphone with a deathly stillness. I didn't scream. In my world, screaming is a waste of vital breath. It's the sound of the defeated. Instead, I operated with the cold detachment of a hunter. With the steady hands of a marksman, I switched the phone to video mode and lowered it toward the floor. Through the narrow gap under the door, the screen revealed a high-definition nightmare. Charcoal wool trousers, Italian silk socks, and the reflection of a man who looked like he belonged in a corporate boardroom in downtown Columbus, not a women's restroom. He began to tap his knuckles against the metal stall door, a rhythmic, mocking sound that vibrated through my soul. Tink, tink, tink. "Abby, I have some candy for you, sweetie," he whispered. The artificial sweetness in his voice made my stomach churn with visceral disgust. It was the sound of a man who viewed my 8-year-old daughter as nothing more than a line item on a high-stakes spreadsheet. Intelligence gathering was complete. I had his face, his voice, and the confirmation of his lethal intent. Now, I needed a sitrep. We were compromised, the perimeter was breached, and the only path left was a tactical extraction. I looked at Abby. I didn't see the little girl who loved glitter and dancing anymore. I saw a soldier's daughter. I gave her the silent hand signals we used during our stealth games back at the base. 1 finger over my lips. Silence. 2 fingers pointing toward the door. Move. Stay low. She nodded, her small chest heaving with silent, terrifying sobs, but she didn't let a single gasp escape. She understood that Mommy wasn't playing anymore. I waited for the precise second he turned his back to the sinks to check his phone again. This was the window. I lunged toward the empty stall next to us and kicked the metal door with every ounce of my combat-trained strength. The loud bang echoed through the restroom like a breaching charge, shattering the predatory silence. "Hey, who's there?" I barked, injecting a calculated note of civilian panic into my voice to mask my true intent. The man lunged toward the sound of the decoy. In that heartbeat of distraction, I scooped Abby up into a fireman's carry, threw open our door, and sprinted. We burst through the restroom exit like ghosts escaping a burning building, our feet pounding against the polished marble of the mall floor. I didn't stop until we were engulfed by the thick, oblivious crowd outside the Macy's department store. We were safe, for 5 minutes. But the soldier in me knew that a threat deferred is not a threat destroyed. I didn't flee to the parking lot. That would be playing his game. I marched Abby straight into the mall security office. The head of security, a portly man leaning back in his chair with a half-eaten pretzel on his desk, looked at my short, cropped hair and rough hands with a bored, condescending smirk. "Take a breath, ma'am. It's probably just some guy who got turned around looking for the family room, he said, waving me off. I didn't waste breath on please. I pulled my military ID from my wallet and slammed it onto his desk with a force that made his soda can jump and the desk rattle. I am Staff Sergeant Barnes, United States Army. There is an adult male currently stalking a minor in the second-floor ladies' room. You will pull the security footage for the restrooms immediately, or I will call 911 and report you for obstructing a federal investigation and harboring a predator. Do I make myself clear, Sergeant? The color drained from his face as he realized he wasn't dealing with a hysterical housewife. He saw the fire in my eyes, the kind of fire that only grows in the dark. Yes, ma'am. 10 minutes later, the monitors flickered. We watched as Brian Hartman was cornered by two Columbus PD officers near the north exit. He didn't struggle. He simply adjusted his silk tie, his face a mask of arrogant indifference. As the officers led him away in handcuffs, he spotted me standing near the fountain, clutching Abby's hand so hard it was white. He smirked, a smile of pure, unadulterated venom. He leaned toward the arresting officer, but his eyes were locked on mine, piercing through the distance. I'm a private investigator on a legal assignment, he shouted, his voice ringing out across the atrium, drawing the eyes of every shopper. And her? He pointed a handcuffed finger at me, his voice dripping with contempt. She's no victim. She's a wild animal in a uniform. Look at her. Short hair, rough hands, smelling like grease and gunpowder. That kind of woman doesn't know how to be a mother. I'm doing that little girl a favor by getting her away from a freak like this. The words felt like a physical slap to my face. The surrounding shoppers, clutching their shopping bags and Starbucks cups, began to whisper, their eyes scanning my appearance with sudden, cold judgment. He wasn't just trying to kidnap my daughter. He was trying to assassinate my character, my service, and my very soul. He thought his money and his suit made him superior to a widow who had bled for this country. He was wrong. This was my ground, and I was going to stand it until the very end. If you feel the fire in Maisie's heart right now, if you believe that no mother should ever be judged for the uniform she wears or the sacrifices she makes for her family, please show your support. Hit the like button to stand with her, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been judged unfairly for who you are? Just type, stay strong below if you are ready to see Maisie fight back for her daughter. Your voice is her strength. The fluorescent lights of the Columbus Police Department hummed with a sterile, buzzing energy that grated against my nerves like sandpaper. I sat on a hard plastic bench, my arm wrapped tightly around Abby. We were safe, or so the paperwork said, but the air in this room felt heavy, tainted by the lingering scent of old coffee and desperation. I watched the hallway, my eyes fixed on the heavy steel door of the processing area. Then he appeared. Brian Hartman wasn't wearing handcuffs anymore. Walking beside him was a man who looked like he had stepped off the cover of a legal journal. Sharp suit, leather briefcase, and a smile that cost $500 an hour. This was the rich man's get-out-of-jail-free card. The lawyer whispered something to the desk sergeant, a brief exchange that turned the officer's professional stiffness into a submissive nod. Hartman adjusted his silk tie, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. He didn't look like a man who had just been caught stalking a child. He looked like a victor. He walked toward the exit, but as he passed our bench, he slowed down. He leaned in just enough for me to smell his expensive cologne, a mixture of mint and something metallic. My client is very concerned about her granddaughter's safety, Hartman said, his voice a low, oily purr. She thinks the military environment is a bit too coarse for a young lady. She thinks you're staining the girl with gunpowder. He didn't wait for a response. He just smirked and walked out into the cool Ohio night. She. My nails dug so deep into my palms that I felt the skin break. There was only one person in my world who used the word coarse to describe my life. Margaret Louise Miller, my mother-in-law. A woman who lived behind a glass wall of old money and Upper Arlington pedigree, watching the rest of the world struggle through a telescope of judgment. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the name on the screen. Mike, my late husband's younger brother. Maisie, my God, I just heard. Is Abby okay? Mike's voice burst through the receiver, sounding breathless and frantic. Too frantic. I heard there was a situation at Polaris. I'm jumping in the car right now to come get you guys. Just stay put. I froze. My internal deception indicators flashed red. I hadn't called Mike. The police hadn't released any names to the press yet. We had been in this station for less than 45 minutes. How did he know we were at Polaris? How did he know there was a situation? The concern in his voice didn't sound like love. It sounded like a script being read by a man who was terrified of missing his cue. How did you know, Mike? I asked, my voice as flat and cold as a grave marker. Someone posted something on Facebook? A woman in a uniform? I just had a feeling, he stammered, his bravado crumbling into a weak, pathetic stutter. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I wasn't at the police station anymore. I was back at the Miller estate last Thanksgiving. The dining room was a sea of white linen, fine china, and silver that had been polished by people Margaret didn't know the names of. I was sitting there in the only Class A uniform I owned, having rushed there straight from the base. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her pearl necklace gleaming like bared teeth. She hadn't looked at me once during the prayer. When the turkey was carved, she finally spoke, her voice cutting through the festive hum like a razor blade. God created women to keep the fire in the kitchen, Maisie, not to carry a rifle in the mud, she had said, her eyes fixed on my calloused hands. David's death, it was the price of your pride. You chose a career over your husband. You chose to be a soldier instead of a wife. And look where it got him. Buried in Arlington while you play hero. Mike had been sitting right next to me. He just stared into his pumpkin soup, his shoulders hunched, his silence a heavy, suffocating weight. He didn't defend me. He didn't look at his mother. He just ate his soup while she dismantled my soul in front of the entire family. General Patton once said that moral courage is the most absent characteristic in men. Looking at Mike that night, I realized he was the living embodiment of that void. Mommy? Abby's voice pulled me back to the present. She was looking up at me, clutching her worn teddy bear. Her eyes were searching mine for a lie, for a sign that everything was actually fine. What is it, sweetie? I whispered, stroking her hair. That mean man. The one in the bathroom, she hesitated, her voice trembling. He smelled like Uncle Mike's car, like mint and those smelly cigarettes. The world tilted on its axis, mint and tobacco. It was the signature scent of the Miller men. But Mike was the only one who still smoked those imported cloves. A tiny detail, sharp as a shard of glass, pierced through the lies. Hartman hadn't just followed us, he had been sitting in Mike's car. My brother-in-law hadn't just heard about the incident, he had helped coordinate it. I looked at the phone in my hand, still glowing with Mike's missed calls. The glass wall was starting to crack, and behind it, I could see the faces of the people I once called family. They weren't coming to save us. They were coming to finish the job. I stood up, my resolve turning into a block of black ice. The hunt was far from over, but now I knew exactly who the wolves were. Mike burst into the police precinct like a man auditioning for the role of a hero in a low-budget soap opera. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his breathing was jagged, loud enough to echo in the sterile lobby. Maisie, Abby, thank God you're safe, he cried out, his voice cracking with a frantic energy that felt entirely manufactured. He lunged forward, his arms open as if to scoop Abby into a grand, protective embrace. I didn't think. I acted. I stepped into his path, my body becoming a solid wall of military-grade muscle and bone. I pulled Abby behind me, my hand resting firmly on her shoulder, my eyes locked onto Mike's. In the Army, we are trained to look for deception indicators, the subtle tells that the body gives when the mind is lying. I saw them all. His pupils were blown wide, a sign of a massive adrenaline spike born of fear, not love. His hands were trembling, and he pointedly avoided my gaze, looking instead at the floor tiles or the vending machine in the corner. How did you get here so fast, Mike? I asked. My voice was a flat line, devoid of the warmth he expected. I just had a gut feeling, he stammered, his lips curling into a crooked, sickly smile. Call it a sixth sense. I was just so worried. A gut feeling. Or a notification from Brian Hartman saying the plan had gone south. I didn't say a word. I just watched him squirm under the weight of my silence. The good uncle act was failing, and the stench of his guilt was stronger than the cheap cologne he used to mask his Clover cigarettes. I told Mike to drive us home so I could pick up my own car. The ride back to my small suburban house was suffocating. Mike tried to fill the silence with mindless chatter about the local Buckeyes game and how dangerous the world was getting. I sat in the passenger seat, a silent observer in my own life, practicing the art of counter-surveillance. When we pulled into my driveway, Mike jumped out to open the gate. As he moved, the tail of his expensive wool coat caught on the seatbelt. A small slip of yellow paper fluttered from his pocket and landed on the floor mat. I reached down and snatched it up before he could turn around. It wasn't a grocery receipt. It was a wire transfer confirmation from a local Chase branch. The recipient, Hartman Investigative Services. The amount, $5,000. The memo line read, Project Polaris, initial retainer. My world didn't just crumble, it turned to ash. $5,000. That was the price of my daughter's safety. My own brother-in-law had paid a predator to stalk us in a public restroom. He had sold out the woman who had carried his brother's casket for 5,000 pieces of silver. I tucked the paper into my pocket, my heart turning into a block of black ice. Everything okay, Maisie? Mike asked, leaning back into the car, his face a mask of false concern. Fine, I replied, my voice as sharp as a bayonet. Just tired. Inside the house, the betrayal grew legs. I remembered the previous week when Mike had insisted on having a spare key. To water the plants when you're on night duty, sis, he had said with that boyish, trustworthy grin. I had believed him. I had let the Trojan horse through my gates. I left Abby in the kitchen with her drawing book and went straight to the living room. I began a systematic sweep of the house, looking for anything that didn't belong. My eyes landed on the mantelpiece, specifically the framed wedding photo of David and me. It was our favorite, David in his dress blues, me in my white gown, both of us looking like we had the whole world at our feet. I tilted the frame. Taped to the back, hidden behind the glass that held our most sacred memory, was a small black device, a high-gain listening bug. A tiny red light blinked once every 5 seconds, a digital eye watching my grief, recording my private conversations with my daughter and feeding them directly to Margaret Miller. He hadn't been watering my plants. He had been harvesting my life. He had turned our sanctuary, the only place where Abby felt truly safe, into a glass cage for his mother's sick amusement. The violation felt more physical than the stalking at the mall. It was a rape of my privacy, a desecration of David's memory. A moment later, Mike walked into the living room, holding a steaming box of pepperoni pizza from the parlor down the street. I got the thin crust Abby likes, he said, his innocent and cruel smile. Thought we could have a normal night. I stood in the center of the room. In my left hand, I held the $5,000 receipt. In my right, the black listening device. I didn't look at him as a sister-in-law. I looked at him as a commander looks at a traitor caught in the wire. The contempt rose in my throat, bitter as bile. A normal night, Mike? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, yet loud enough to command the air in the room. I held up the bug, the red light reflecting in my cold, hard eyes. Is this what your mother calls normal? The pizza box slipped from his hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The smell of melted cheese and tomato sauce filled the air, a sickening contrast to the war that had just been declared in my living room. This night was far from over, and Mike Miller was about to find out exactly what happens when you betray a soldier. If your heart is pounding with rage alongside Maisie right now, if you believe that a mother's home should be a sacred sanctuary, please hit the like button to stand with her. We want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a betrayal that cut this deep? Share your strength by typing "Stay Strong" in the comments below. Your interaction helps more people find Maisie's story and join her fight for justice. Let's show this family that they messed with the wrong mother. The air in the precinct's interview room was thick with the smell of floor wax and the low, incessant hum of a broken air conditioner. The detective, a man with tired eyes and a stained tie, placed a black leather briefcase on the scratched wooden table. It had been recovered from Brian Hartman's SUV. Inside, tucked between high-end surveillance equipment, was a thick, cerulean folder. It was labeled in a neat, calligraphic script that I recognized instantly. Target, Reconstruction Project. My fingers trembled as I flipped open the cover. I expected photos of the mall, or perhaps our house. I didn't expect to see a grainy, black and white still extracted from a hospital security camera dated 8 years ago. It was the day I gave birth to Abby. In the photo, I was pale, exhausted, clutching my newborn daughter while David stood by my side, beaming with a pride that could light up a stadium. Beneath the photo, in my mother-in-law's elegant handwriting, was a note written in fountain pen ink. The mistake began on this day. Needs correction. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of the table. Margaret didn't see the birth of her granddaughter as a miracle. She saw the fact that Abby was born to me, a girl from a blue-collar neighborhood, a woman who wore combat boots instead of pearls, as a systemic error. A glitch in the Miller bloodline. I turned the page, and the physical violation continued. There were hundreds of photos. They had been watching us for 6 months. I saw a picture of myself collapsed on our living room sofa, still wearing my mud-caked ACUs after a 48-hour field exercise. My face was covered in camouflage grease, my eyes shut in a sleep of pure exhaustion. Beside me, Abby was sitting on the carpet, quietly building a Lego castle. Hartman's typed caption beneath it was a surgical strike to my soul. Subject in state of extreme fatigue, unable to interact with child. Environment of neglect. I felt the heat rise in my chest, a burning, righteous fury. They took my sacrifice, the days I spent in the dirt and the rain so my daughter could sleep in a safe house, and they twisted it into a crime. They saw my service as a failure of motherhood. The next photo showed us at the McDonald's drive-thru on a Friday night. I was laughing, handing Abby a happy meal. I remembered that night. We were celebrating her straight A report card. The caption read, "Poor nutritional standards. Routine abuse of junk food to compensate for maternal absence." Every hug, every meal, every tired smile I'd ever given my daughter had been documented, analyzed, and weaponized. They weren't looking for a mother. They were looking for a reason to erase me. But the true horror lay at the back of the file. It was a pre-filled, unsigned contract for St. Michael's Military Boarding Academy in Virginia. 800 miles away. Attached to it was a personal letter from Margaret to the headmaster. "My granddaughter has been infected with the vulgar habits and the coarseness of the lower classes from her mother," the letter read. "I require the school's most ironclad discipline to wash her clean, to turn her into a true Miller lady. I want all traces of that woman removed from her spirit." She didn't want to raise Abby. She wanted to reprogram her. She wanted to ship an 8-year-old girl across state lines to a place of iron discipline, just to spite the woman her son had loved. It was a blueprint for psychological kidnapping. The final document was a financial spreadsheet. Margaret had listed my sergeant's pay, my housing allowance, and my modest savings account. Beside it, she had listed the Miller family trust, the real estate holdings, and her own 7-figure inheritance. The conclusion was highlighted in a violent, bloody red. Subject lacks financial capacity to provide a standard lifestyle. Recommend using economic leverage to force an immediate surrender of parental rights. She thought my love had a price tag. She thought that because she had more zeros in her bank account, she owned the rights to my daughter's heart. She viewed my motherhood as a commercial transaction, a business deal that she could close with enough pressure. I closed the file, the blue cardboard feeling like lead in my hands. The bile rose in my throat, bitter and acidic. This wasn't the concern of a grandmother. This was a death warrant for the only family I had left. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting a legal battle. I was fighting a monster who believed that money was God and that my uniform was a badge of inferiority. Margaret Miller had spent 6 months documenting my failures. Now, she was about to find out exactly what a coarse woman from the lower classes does when you try to take her child. I tossed the high-gain listening bug and the yellow wire transfer receipt onto the coffee table. The tiny black device and the crumpled paper landed with a dry, hollow thud right next to the box of pepperoni pizza that was already growing cold in the stagnant air of the living room. It was the sound of a judge's gavel coming down in a silent courtroom. Mike jumped as if I had fired a warning shot over his head. The blood drained from his face instantly, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. Maisie, I can explain, he stammered, his voice thin and reeking of desperation. I raised my hand, a sharp horizontal motion that cut the air between us. It was a gesture of absolute command, the kind I used on the range to halt a firing line. Mike's mouth snapped shut. You aren't explaining a damn thing, Mike, I said. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. My voice was a low, resonant vibration, cold enough to frost the windows. You are going to confess. Sit down. I pointed to the armchair opposite me. I stood perfectly still, my feet shoulder-width apart, my hands clasped loosely behind my back. In the military, we call this command presence. I let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, until the only sound in the room was the ragged, uneven rhythm of Mike's breathing. He sat down slowly, his body hunching inward, shrinking until he looked like a small, frightened child caught in a lie he couldn't outrun. Why? I asked. One word. A single syllable that demanded an accounting for his soul. Mike bowed his head, and the first sob escaped him. A weak, pathetic sound. Tears began to track through the stubble on his cheeks, but these weren't tears of remorse. They were the tears of a coward who had been cornered. Mom said, "She said you weren't stable, Maisie," he sobbed, his voice trembling as he tried to wrap himself in the blanket of his mother's manipulation. "She told me your job was too dangerous. She said if you died in some desert halfway across the world, Abby would be left with nothing. She told me she just wanted what was best for the girl." I felt a cold, jagged laugh rise in my throat, but I didn't let it out. I just looked at him with pure, unadulterated contempt. What was best for her, Mike? Hiring a man to stalk an 8-year-old in a public restroom? That's what you call best? Or was it the plan to ship her off to a boarding school 800 miles away where she wouldn't remember the sound of my voice? Are you a complete idiot or just a goddamn sociopath? I moved closer, leaning down until I was inches from his face, forcing him to smell the gunpowder and the grit that Margaret so despised. I needed to shatter the delusion he had built to protect his fragile ego. I needed him to see the filth he had allowed into my home. I did it for David, Mike suddenly wailed, his voice rising in a desperate, high-pitched plea. He wanted me to protect this family. He would have understood. That was the breaking point. The mention of my husband's name coming out of his mouth felt like a physical violation. I stood up abruptly, walked to the fireplace mantel, and snatched the framed photo of David in his captain's dress blues. I didn't set it down. I shoved it directly into Mike's line of sight, inches from his watery eyes. "Don't you ever mention his name with that filthy mouth again," I hissed, my words sharp as a bayonet. "David died protecting the freedoms you're using to spy on his widow. He died for honor. He died for loyalty. Do you think he'd be proud of you right now, Mike? Do you think he'd look at his little brother and see a man? If David were standing in this room, he wouldn't be explaining things to you. He'd be throwing you out of this house with his bare hands." Mike crumbled. He put his face in his hands and began to weep uncontrollably, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his own insignificance. The image of his hero brother was the final blow that crushed his remaining defenses. "Tell me the truth, Mike, all of it, before I call the military police and have them drag you out of here in front of Abby." Through the gasping sobs, the ugly, naked truth finally bled out. She promised that if I helped her get full custody, she'd give me control over Abby's trust fund. I'm in deep, Maisie. I owe over $50,000 to an offshore gambling site. They were threatening to come to the office. I needed the money. I just needed the money. I stood frozen, the silence in the room suddenly deafening. $50,000. That was the price of a mother's heart. My mother-in-law hadn't just used Mike's weakness. She had bought it. She had turned my own family into a mercenary force to steal my daughter's future so she could pay off a coward's gambling debts. A wave of visceral disgust washed over me, stronger than any fear I'd felt at the mall. This family wasn't just broken, it was a rotting corpse. Margaret Miller had spent $50,000 to buy a son's betrayal, and Mike had sold his soul for a pile of digital poker chips. I looked at Mike, recoiling as if from a poisonous snake. "Get out," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Take your pizza and your lies and get out of my house before I lose whatever mercy I have left." Mike didn't argue. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling over the pizza box, and fled into the night. I stood alone in the center of my violated sanctuary, clutching David's photo to my chest. The first battle was over, but the war for Abby had only just begun. The morning sun crawled through the blinds of the county sheriff's office, casting long, barred shadows across the floor that looked like a cage. I was already there, sitting in a wooden chair with my spine straight as a bayonet. I wasn't wearing civilian clothes today. I was in my Class A dress uniform, the fabric crisp, the creases sharp enough to cut, and the medals on my chest gleaming with the weight of every sacrifice David and I had ever made. Then, the door opened and the air in the room died. Margaret Louise Miller didn't walk in. She made an entrance. She was draped in a tailored Chanel suit the color of a winter storm. A multi-strand pearl necklace resting against her throat like a polished yoke. She moved as if she owned the very air we breathed, followed closely by a man in a $3,000 suit. A lawyer known in Columbus as the Shark for his ability to make truth disappear. She didn't look at me. To Margaret, I was just part of the furniture, a piece of low-class debris to be swept away. She sat down, crossing her legs with a rustle of expensive silk, and looked directly at the sheriff. "Sheriff Thompson," she began, her voice a practiced melody of upper-class concern. "I'm here to demand the immediate release of my investigator and to file a formal complaint. My daughter-in-law—" She flicked a manicured hand in my direction without turning her head. "Used physical intimidation to threaten my son last night. She is a violent woman, Sheriff. A byproduct of her environment." She was flipping the script. She was turning my defense of my home into an act of thuggery. "I am merely a worried grandmother," Margaret continued, her voice trembling with a well-rehearsed tremor. "My granddaughter is living in a cramped apartment that reeks of gunpowder and sweat. Her mother is gone for weeks at a time, playing soldier in some godforsaken desert. Abby needs stability. She needs culture. She needs class." She leaned forward, the diamond on her finger catching the light and flashing like a warning beacon. "Maisie is destroying the Miller bloodline with her coarseness. I am prepared to pay whatever it takes to save that little girl from this life. I will not have my granddaughter raised by a woman who thinks a rifle is a substitute for a soul." I stood up. I didn't need a microphone to command the room. My voice came from my boots, deep and resonant, the voice of a non-commissioned officer who had led men through hell. "You speak of coarseness, Mrs. Miller?" I asked. The sheriff, an old Marine with silver hair and eyes like flint, leaned back and crossed his arms, silencing the lawyer's attempt to interrupt with a single, sharp look. "Coarseness is hiring a stranger to lurk in a bathroom and watch your granddaughter through a gap in a stall door," I said, my words falling like heavy artillery. "Coarseness is using $50,000 to buy your own son's soul, so he'll betray his brother's memory. You have the money, you have the mansion, and you have the pearls, but you are morally bankrupt. You think you're saving Abby? You're trying to buy a human being to fill the empty space where your heart should be." Margaret's face tightened, the skin pulling back over her cheekbones until she looked like a porcelain mask. "Class is something you are born with, Maisie. It is not something you can earn with a few pieces of tin on your chest. These pieces of tin," I said, gesturing to my medals, "were earned in the arena. They were earned with blood, sweat, and the kind of grit you couldn't imagine in your wildest nightmares. Teddy Roosevelt once spoke of the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat. That's me. I've been in the arena for my country, and I'm in the arena for my daughter. You? You're just a spectator in a Chanel suit, throwing stones from the sidelines." The room went silent, so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall ticking away the seconds of Margaret's reign. The door opened again. A social worker stepped in, holding Abby's hand. This was the moment I had gambled everything on. I had insisted that Abby speak for herself. Margaret's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. She stood up, spreading her arms wide. Abby, darling, come to Grandma. We're going to go get some ice cream, and then we'll look at your new room at the academy. It has a view of the gardens. Abby stopped. She looked at the grandmother who offered her gardens and ice cream, and then she looked at me, her mother, standing in a uniform that smelled of starch and duty. Abby didn't run to the pearls. She shrunk back, tucking herself behind my leg, her small hand gripping my trousers so hard her knuckles turned white. No, Abby said. Her voice was small, but it cut through Margaret's polished facade like a diamond through glass. Grandma, you made Uncle Mike cry. You made my mommy sad. I don't want to go to a school with a garden. I want to stay in my house. I want my mommy. Margaret stood frozen, her arms still open in a grotesque parody of a hug. For the first time in her life, her money was worthless. Her power was an empty shell. Her low-class daughter-in-law had something that all the Miller millions could never buy: the unconditional love of a child. If you felt the power in Abby's voice just now, if you believe that a mother's love is worth more than all the gold in the world, please hit the like button. This is the moment Maisie has fought for, and she needs to know you are standing with her. Tell us in the comments. What would you say to someone who tried to buy your family? Type justice below if you are cheering for Maisie and Abby right now. Your voice makes this victory even stronger. The final strike of the judge's gavel did not ring out with the thunderous triumph I had expected. Instead, it was a dull, wooden thud that signaled the end of my life as I knew it. The Franklin County Courthouse felt like a tomb of cold marble and bitter truths. Within those walls, the law had carved a permanent line in the sand. 5 years, 1,000 feet. That was the distance Margaret Louise Miller was now legally required to maintain between her venom and my daughter's soul. I watched as the court officers escorted her out. She didn't scream or fight. A woman of her standing wouldn't dream of such a vulgar display in public. She simply straightened her Chanel jacket, her movements stiff and robotic. But as she passed me, she turned her head just enough for me to see her eyes. They were the eyes of a rattlesnake whose fangs had been pulled, full of a quiet, concentrated hatred that promised the war was far from over. Behind her, Mike drifted like a ghost. His head bowed so low I could only see the crown of his hair. He was a man who had lost everything: his brother's legacy, his sister-in-law's trust, and his own dignity, all for a gambling debt he could never truly repay. The drive back to our suburban home in the outskirts of Columbus was silent. The evening rain began to fall, a soft rhythmic patter against the windshield that sounded like muffled tears. When we stepped inside, the air in the apartment felt different. It was lighter without the hidden microphones and the heavy shroud of Margaret's surveillance, yet it was also hauntingly empty. The space seemed to have expanded, the walls stretching further apart as if mocking my sudden solitude. Abby went straight to her room, but her usual laughter was missing. I began to move through the house with a frantic, desperate energy. I grabbed a large black trash bag and started in the living room. I moved toward the corner where Mike's gifts were piled: the expensive remote-controlled cars, the plush bears with their plastic, unblinking eyes, and the bright Lego sets he used as bribes. I threw them into the bag, one by one. Each dull thunk against the plastic was a reminder of a lie. I needed to purge this sanctuary. I needed to scrub the scent of mint and clover cigarettes from the curtains until only the smell of home remained. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking and my breath was coming in jagged, uneven gasps. I was a staff sergeant. I had led troops through sandstorms and mortar fire, yet cleaning out a child's playroom felt like the hardest mission I had ever undertaken. I realized then that the obstacle was indeed the way. The pain of this isolation was the price of our freedom. Later that night, the house was submerged in a thick, velvety darkness. I was drifting towards sleep when I felt a small weight press against my side. Abby crawled under my duvet, her small body shivering despite the warmth of the house. She clung to me as if I were the only solid thing left in a world made of smoke. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Are Grandma and Uncle Mike bad people?" The question felt like a bayonet to the chest. How do you explain the complexities of greed and generational trauma to an 8-year-old girl? I stroked her hair, staring up at the ceiling where the shadows of the oak trees outside danced like monsters. "They aren't all bad, honey," I said, choosing my words with the precision of a sniper. "But they let bad thoughts lead them down a dark path. Sometimes people get so lost in their own selfishness that they forget how to love the right way. To keep you safe, we have to stay away from that darkness. We have to be our own light." Abby eventually fell into a fitful sleep, her breathing finally evening out against my shoulder. I, however, remained wide awake. I climbed out of bed and walked into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of Cabernet. It was the cheap stuff from the local grocery store, acidic and sharp, but I needed something to ground me. I sat on the floor in front of the fireplace, looking up at the framed photo of David. He looked so young in his captain's uniform, his eyes filled with a bright, uncomplicated hope for a future we would never share. "I'm sorry, David," I whispered to the empty room. My voice was a hollow rasp that barely broke the silence. "I had to do it. I had to banish your mother and your brother. I had to tear your family apart to save our daughter. I broke the very thing you asked me to protect." The tears finally came then, hot, silent, and bitter. I had won the legal battle. I had secured the restraining order and kept my daughter by my side. But as I sat there in the dark, clutching the photo of a dead man, I realized the victory tasted like ash. I had saved the child, but in doing so, I had become an island. The silence of the house was my new reality, a quiet front line where the only soldier left standing was a widow with a broken heart and a glass of cheap wine. The cost of peace was total isolation, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to pay it. The rainy season in Ohio has a way of turning the world into a gray, blurred reflection of itself. For 7 days, the sky above our small suburban street remained a heavy, weeping canvas. Inside, the silence was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a reminder of the vacuum left behind when you excise a tumor from your life. I spent my evenings staring at the empty spaces on the shelves where Mike's lies used to sit, wondering if a house could ever truly be clean once it had been haunted. On the 8th day, the downpour turned torrential. I was standing by the kitchen window, clutching a mug of black coffee, when I saw him. A lone figure stood on the opposite side of the asphalt, a shadow against the gray sheets of rain. It was Mike. He wasn't wearing a jacket or carrying an umbrella. He just stood there, soaked to the bone, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He didn't move. He didn't wave. Most importantly, he didn't cross the street. He stayed exactly 1,001 feet away, honoring the boundary the court had carved between us with a devotion that bordered on the religious. He stood like a sentry of his own guilt, a living statue of penance. Abby came up beside me, her small hand resting on the windowsill. She watched the man across the street, her brow furrowed in that way she inherited from David. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice thick with the uncomplicated mercy of a child. "Uncle Mike is getting all wet. He's going to get sick, isn't he?" I felt the iron casing around my heart develop a hairline fracture. In the military, we are taught that mercy is a luxury you can't afford on the front lines. But looking at my daughter's eyes, I realized that for her, Mike wasn't a traitor or a mercenary. He was just the uncle who played Legos and made her laugh. Her capacity to love was the very thing I was fighting to protect. And yet, it was the very thing that was forcing me to reconsider my defensive perimeter. "Go finish your homework, sweetie," I said softly. Once she was gone, I pulled on my raincoat and walked out to the mailbox. I didn't look across the street. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a glance. Inside the metal box, tucked behind a coupon for a local pizza parlor, was a soaked, heavy envelope. There was no money inside, no desperate pleas for a loan. Instead, it was a stack of legal documents. I leaned against the mailbox, the rain drumming against my hood as I flipped through the pages. Mike had filed a voluntary, irrevocable waiver of his right to manage or influence Abby's trust fund. He had transferred all control to an independent third-party firm, locking himself out of the Miller fortune forever. There was a handwritten note at the bottom, the ink bleeding into the damp paper. "I am clean now, Maisie. I've started the program. I've cut her off. The money, the influence, all of it. I'm working at a warehouse in Grove City. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm just trying to become a man that David wouldn't be ashamed to call his brother. I looked across the street then. Mike was still there, shivering, his face pale and haggard. He looked like a man who had finally hit the bottom and decided to stop digging. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs with a sudden, sharp clarity. Resentment, I realized, was like drinking poison and hoping it would kill your enemies. I was tired of the taste of poison. I grabbed a large black umbrella from the porch and walked to the edge of the driveway. I didn't cross over to his side, but I stood where he could see me. "Go home, Mike," I shouted over the roar of the rain. He looked up, startled, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He began to turn away, his head bowed in defeat. "Go home," I repeated, my voice steady and commanding. "Get into some dry clothes, and be back here at 5 o'clock tomorrow evening for dinner. Do not be 1 minute late." Mike froze. He looked back at me, his mouth slightly open, as if he were witnessing a miracle he didn't deserve. "Maisie, do you mean it? You're giving me a chance?" I tightened my grip on the umbrella. "This is not a second chance, Mike. This is probation. You want to be Abby's uncle? You earn it, every single day. You will provide a weekly accounting of your sobriety and your employment. You will be honest about everything. One more lie, one single, tiny deception, and you are gone from our lives forever. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal," he choked out, a sob breaking through his voice. The following evening, the doorbell rang at exactly 4:55. Mike was standing there, his hair neatly combed, wearing a simple flannel shirt and jeans that looked like they had been washed 10 times. He wasn't carrying expensive gifts this time. He held a small basic Lego set, the kind you buy at a pharmacy for $10. "I bought this with my first paycheck," he said, his voice quiet. "From the warehouse." Dinner was a quiet affair. We had a simple meatloaf and mashed potatoes, the kind of meal Margaret Miller would have sneered at. The atmosphere was thick with a hesitant, fragile tension, but Abby didn't seem to notice. She prattled on about her science project, her voice filling the gaps in our conversation like gold leaf in a cracked vase. I watched Mike as he listened to her. He didn't look like a pawn or a coward anymore. He looked like a man who was finally learning the weight of his own skin. He laughed at one of her jokes, a genuine, light-hearted sound that I hadn't heard from him in years. He wasn't the Uncle Mike who brought the world to her feet. He was the uncle who was willing to build a small plastic tower on the floor and listen to her dreams. The bridge of forgiveness wasn't built in that one night. It was barely a single plank laid across a vast, dark chasm. But as I sat there, watching the two of them, I realized that the seeds of redemption had finally found some honest soil. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the betrayal. It's about choosing not to let that betrayal define your future. Tonight, we weren't a broken family. We were a work in progress. 6 months have passed since the storm broke, and the morning sun in Ohio finally feels like a blessing rather than a spotlight. I decided to sell the old apartment, the place where the walls still seemed to whisper with the echoes of hidden microphones and the cold scent of Margaret's entitlement. We packed our lives into a few dozen boxes and moved to a small 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of the city, just 10 minutes from the gates of the military base. Here, the grass is a vibrant, emerald green, and there is enough room in the backyard for Abby to run until her lungs are full of clean air. Our neighbors are military families, people who understand that a uniform isn't a costume and that a deployment isn't just a business trip. There are no more prying eyes or whispered judgments from the elite circles of Upper Arlington. Instead, there are respectful nods over the fence and the shared silence of people who know the true cost of freedom. On the day we moved in, I hung a simple wooden plaque above the front door. It reads, "Home of the free, because of the brave." Every time I look at it, I feel a surge of quiet, unshakable pride. Mike kept his word. He stayed in the program, attended every session, and took the hardest path he could find. He didn't ask for a loan or a handout. He found work at a local lumber yard in Grove City, traded his designer suits for rugged work boots, and spent his days hauling timber until his hands were calloused and his back was sore. He comes over every Saturday afternoon. He doesn't bring expensive electronics or jewelry anymore. Instead, he brings his time. I watch them from the kitchen window, Mike and Abby in the backyard. He's teaching her how to hold a baseball bat, his voice patient and steady. When she finally hits the ball, his cheer is louder than anyone's on the street. Sometimes when he kneels down to help her adjust her helmet or tie her sneakers, I see a ghost in the way he moves. I see a flicker of David in the curve of his smile and the protective way he stands over her. Mike isn't trying to replace my husband, and he knows he never could. But he is finally becoming the man David always believed he could be, a man of his word, a man of character, and a true uncle. In the gilded hallways of Upper Arlington, the news is much colder. Margaret Miller lives alone in that sprawling mansion, a queen without a kingdom. The scandal of the blue file and the restraining order didn't just stay in the courtroom, it bled into the local newspapers and the country club gossip. The elite women who once competed for an invitation to her Christmas gala have turned their backs, terrified of being tarnished by the Hartman scandal. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she goes through housekeepers every 2 weeks. No one can stand the acidic tongue of a woman who has everything but loves nothing. She has millions of dollars in the bank, but she eats her dinner in a dining room that holds 30 people and yet remains completely silent. She built a prison out of her own arrogance, and now she's the only inmate. Her money couldn't buy her a seat at our table, and it certainly couldn't buy her a way into Abby's heart. Today is a morning of gold and emerald. It is the day of the annual Girl Scouts badge ceremony, and the local community center is packed with families. I'm standing in the front row, wearing my dress uniform, my posture perfect and my heart hammering against my ribs, with a joy I haven't felt in years. Abby stands on the stage, her small face radiant with confidence. She isn't the frightened little girl who hid behind my legs at the mall anymore. She is a leader. When the troop leader calls her name to receive her first badge for courage and confidence, Abby steps forward and gives a crisp, military salute that she's been practicing for weeks. The crowd erupts in applause. Beside me, Mike is holding up his phone, filming every second. I can see the moisture in his eyes, the raw emotion of a man who realized that the most precious things in life don't come in a Chanel box. We've survived the winter. We've fought the monsters, both in the shadows and in our own bloodline. As we walk out of the center and into the bright Ohio spring, Abby grabs my hand and Mike's hand, swinging her arms between us. I look up at the sky, feeling the warmth on my face. Family, I've realized, isn't just about the blood that flows through your veins. It's about the people who are willing to stand in the arena with you when the world is throwing stones. It's about the people who fight for you when you're tired and the people who love you enough to tell you the truth. We are a new unit now, a different kind of deployment. And as we head toward our little house near the base, I know that for the first time in a very long time, we are finally, truly, home. 1 year has passed since the cerulean file was closed and the restraining orders were signed. Today, the air at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base carries a crisp, electric charge. I stand on the mahogany stage of the auditorium, my boots polished to a mirror shine, my posture as rigid as the steel beams holding up the hangar. The brass band has just finished the final notes of the national anthem, and a heavy, respectful silence fills the room. Today is my promotion ceremony. The commanding officer steps forward, his face a map of decades of service. He unpins the old rank from my shoulders and replaces them with the 3 chevrons and 3 rockers of a master sergeant. It is a weight I have carried in my soul for years, but feeling the physical metal on my uniform makes it real. This isn't just a military milestone. It is a victory for every night I spent balancing a rifle and a diaper bag. It is a testament to a woman who refused to let her family's wreckage become her destination. I look down at the front row. There is no Chanel suit in the audience, no pearls, no cold stares, no lawyers in $3,000 suits. Instead, I see Abby, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and love. Beside her sits Mike, looking healthier than I have ever seen him. He wears a simple button-down shirt and a quiet smile of genuine pride. They are my unit. They are the survivors of the storm. I step up to the podium. In the military, we are taught to keep our speeches short and our intent clear. I look out at the sea of uniforms, young men and women who are just beginning their journey, and I decide to speak from the heart of a mother. There is a common myth in our society, I begin, my voice projected with the clarity of a drill instructor and the warmth of a parent. People say that a woman cannot have it all. They say you cannot serve your country with excellence while serving your children with devotion. They say the military is no place for a mother. I stand before you today as Master Sergeant Maisie Barnes to tell you that they are wrong. We do not fight in spite of our children. We fight because of them. We endure the mud, the sand, and the silence of deployment so that our children can sleep in houses where the only sound is the wind in the trees. Motherhood isn't a distraction from duty. It is the ultimate motivation. Love is the greatest force multiplier we have. The applause that follows is not the polite clapping of a social gala. It is a thunderous roar, a rhythmic beating of palms that shakes the very floorboards. I see several young female soldiers in the back rows, their faces wet with tears, nodding in a silent recognition of a truth they finally heard out loud. After the ceremony, the auditorium empties, leaving only the three of us in the fading light. Abby runs up the steps and throws her arms around my waist, burying her face in the starch of my uniform. I pick her up, feeling the solid, precious weight of her. I take off my service cap, the one with the silver eagle, and place it on her head. It's far too big, sliding down to her eyebrows. But she stands tall, her chin tucked in a perfect imitation of a soldier. "Mommy," she says, her voice ringing with a new kind of steel. "When I grow up, I want to be just like you. I want to be a soldier." I kneel down until we are eye to eye, adjusting the cap so she can see the world clearly. "No, Abby," I say, my voice a soft, fierce whisper. "Don't be like me. Be better than me. Be stronger than I ever was. Be smarter, be kinder, and never let anyone tell you that your value is written in a bank ledger. I didn't leave you $1 million trust fund or a mansion on a hill. I'm leaving you something much more permanent. I'm leaving you the legacy of your own name. I'm leaving you the knowledge that you are a Barnes and we do not break." She nods, a solemn understanding passing between us that transcends her 9 years of life. I realized then that I had successfully defended the only fortress that truly mattered. Margaret Miller had tried to buy my daughter's future, but I had given Abby something that could never be seized by a court or sold by a coward: her own self-respect. We leave the base as the sun begins its slow descent, painting the Ohio sky in bruised purples and burning oranges. Mike is at the wheel, humming a soft tune, while Abby sings along to the radio in the back seat. I sit in the passenger side, watching the American flag at the main gate flutter in the rearview mirror. The road ahead is long, and there will be other battles. There will be nights of doubt and days of struggle. But as I look at my reflection in the window, I don't see a victim. I don't see a grieving widow or a woman defined by a betrayal. I am Master Sergeant Maisie Barnes. I am a mother. I am a warrior. And I have brought my family home to stay. Perpetual optimism isn't just a phrase, it is my armor. And tonight, for the first time in my life, the armor feels light. As I stand here today, the greatest lesson I've learned isn't about battlefield tactics, but about the architecture of a resilient soul. Life will test your perimeter, and sometimes the breach comes from those you trusted most. But remember this: your value is never defined by someone else's bank account or their narrow perception of your worth. True wealth is found in integrity, in the courage to set firm boundaries, and in the unwavering love we provide for our children. Build your life on the bedrock of truth, because while lies may sprint, the truth always runs the marathon. Thank you for walking this long, difficult road with Abby and me. Your presence in this arena means more than words can express. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own strength, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to join our growing community of warriors. I want to hear your voice. What does family mean to you after everything we've witnessed? Share your thoughts or simply type "true strength" in the comments below to stand with us. Together, we prove that no one can break a heart built on honor.